Northern California, June 25, 1846. In the burgeoning heat of the summer morning, the small village of Sonoma stirs with children at play, animals stirring, and citizens conducting business and carrying out chores. For weeks now, the small hamlet situated just north of San Francisco has been caught up in a groundswell of political upheaval that has been fostering amongst the American immigrants to this territory still owned by Mexico. Roughly 2 weeks earlier, 2 Americans named Fowler and Cowie had ventured to Bodega Bay from Sonoma in hopes of procuring arms and ammunition. They had been caught en route by Mexican guerrilla forces and, after being tied to a pair of oak trees and tortured, had been hanged. On June 14, 1846, the town had been taken over by men claiming it in the name of the Bear Flag Republic. Roughly 30 men, under the leadership of 40-year-old former mountain man Ezekiel Stuttering Zeke Merritt, had taken over Sonoma to essentially no resistance. The founder and mayor of the town, General Mariano Vallejo, is placed under arrest, and a white flag with a makeshift bear on it is raised over the town. The news of this action reaches California Governor Pio Pico, who orders Captain Joaquin de la Torre to take a contingent of soldiers under his command and quash this troublesome rebellion. But, much to his dismay, de la Torre has been repeatedly repulsed by the Americans, who are now calling themselves Osos, or Bears. The news of this action also soon reaches the ears of one Captain John C. Fremont. Though ostensibly on an exploratory mission at the behest of the United States government, Fremont has long fostered hopes that the Americans living in Mexico's Alta California would rebel against their overseers and annex California in the name of the United States. Now, the ambitious army officer who has advanced to the odd but prestigious position of military officer in charge of a scientific expedition is heartened to hear that his hopes have become a reality. Fremont and his party have spent the previous few years carrying out a variety of exploratory missions that have seen them cover vast expanses of the American West, and California in particular. They have survived all manner of privation, hardship, and travail. Just weeks prior, 3 members of their party had been killed by native warriors, believed to be Modocs, on the shores of what is today Oregon's Klamath Lake. Though many in the band are experienced mountain men and soldiers, they all readily acquiesce to the fact that they owe their survival, in large part, to the efforts of their legendary guide, Christopher Houston Carson, otherwise known as Kit Carson. Though only 36 years old, Kit Carson is already a legendary figure on the American frontier. Tales of his daring exploits in fighting native warriors, trapping little-known areas, and surviving all manner of wilderness hardships are well known by many on the eastern seaboard due to the popularity of the dime novels bearing his name. Though many are largely or entirely fictionalized, and Carson himself often bristles at any mention of his own celebrity, he is a celebrity nonetheless. However, despite his notoriety, Carson is a steadfastly dutiful and loyal man, whose already fastidious obedience to Fremont's authority has been even further solidified since the officer saved his life after riding his imposing warhorse, a large gray steed named Sacramento, over a native warrior who had drawn an arrow on Carson in the woods of southern Oregon. The fact that this had likely saved his life is not lost on the legendary mountain man, and when Fremont suddenly gives the order that the party will make their way to Sonoma to reinforce and oversee the rebel forces, Carson obeys without question. Now, as the party makes its way into the small town during this sweltering morning on June 25th, the townsfolk are brought to a momentary pause. The men, who have for the most part made their homes in the wilderness for the preceding several months, cause quite a stir with the spectacle they present amidst the comparatively genteel townsfolk. In their trek southward to Sonoma, they have taken on several volunteers, and now present a buckskin-clad, ill-kempt, and unshaven multinational spectacle to the observing Sonomans. One among them commented that Fremont's group was composed of Americans, French, English, Swiss, Poles, Russians, Chileans, Germans, Greeks, Austrians, and Pawnees, and if De La Torre could beat them, he could beat the whole world. Within a matter of days, Fremont has taken over the town and taken over leadership of the rebellion. As the ranking military officer for hundreds of miles, Fremont exercises his martial authority over the rebels and promises them protection for their obedience. The settlers of Sonoma agree. even acquiescing to Fremont's request to formally move the recognized start date of the rebellion to coincide with his arrival, to defer all military and civil command to him, and to refer to him as Oso 1. He begins signing all letters and dispatches Captain John C. Fremont, Commander-in-Chief of Military Forces in California, and orders the Osos under his command to iron and confine any person who shall disobey your commands, and to shoot any person who shall endanger the safety of the town. Among the Americans now caught in the fray of revolutionary politics and policing is Johann Sutter, a German-born, Swiss-descended immigrant who, in but a few years' time, will change California history forever with the discovery of gold at his lumber mill on the American River. However, now, in 1846, he is simply a prominent local who is beginning to find Fremont's methods distasteful, if not outright untenable. But when Sutter opposes the extremity of Fremont's orders to the ever more haughty officer's face, Fremont scornfully responds that if Sutter has any problems with his leadership, he can simply join up with the Mexican army. Such dismissiveness and self-importance begins to become more and more the order of the day for those dealing with Fremont. He expects those under his command to exhibit only loyalty, obedience, and discipline. One among his party who he can always count on to embody these traits is Kit Carson. Despite his advantage in both experience and ability, Carson time and again plays the part of dutiful sideman, seeing fit only to follow and enforce, but never to lead. However, Carson's reticence to command suits Fremont perfectly, and, of course, when Fremont decides within a few days of arriving in Sonoma that he must take the offensive and pursue Captain de la Torre, he chooses Kit Carson to accompany himself and a small contingent as they set out to engage the Mexican commander on his own ground. The party makes its way southwest from Sonoma to San Rafael, situated just north of San Francisco Bay. On their march, they intercept a Mexican army courier carrying dispatches from Captain de la Torre himself. Following the intelligence gleaned from the intercepted dispatches, Fremont leads the party straight to the northern shores of San Francisco Bay, near present-day San Quentin. However, the courier he has intercepted, as well as the information that the man carries, are all part of a carefully planned ruse being carried out by Captain de la Torre. When the Fremont party arrives on the shores of San Francisco Bay on Sunday, June 28, 1846, they are greeted by a confusingly empty expanse of coastline where they had expected to meet lines of Mexican soldiers ready to meet them in battle. Fremont is both embarrassed and incensed. His hopes of a swift and glorious victory have not only been dashed, but he has been made a fool of by the Mexican officer's clever deception. How, Fremont wonders, can he possibly conduct a successful war against an enemy who refuses to fight and who he cannot find? As the party of men lingers on the shores of the shallow bay, Fremont ponders his next move. He intends to take California by sweeping southward, from San Francisco to Santa Barbara, then on to Los Angeles and San Diego. But now, instead of a decisive victory, he has let his enemy slip away. Then, Fremont spots a small rowboat crossing the bay, headed for shore near he and his party's location. The small vessel makes its way through the brackish, chilly waters to the shoreline, where 3 men disembark and come ashore. They are 20-year-old Ramon de Haro and his twin brother, Francisco de Haro. They are sons of Don Francisco de Haro, former alcalde of San Francisco during the years of 1834, as well as 1838 through 1839. They are accompanied by their uncle, José de los Reyes Berriesa. Though the 3 are clearly civilians and not party to the actions of the Mexican military, Fremont orders Carson to detain them and search them for documents. Carson barks at the confused and increasingly fearful men to hand over any correspondence that they have on their person. All 3 insist that they have none, and are simply on a personal errand to meet friends and family in Sonoma. Carson, still unsure whether the men are telling the truth, calls out to Fremont, who is impatiently seated on his horse roughly 50 yards away. "Should I take these men prisoners?" he asks Fremont. "I have no use for prisoners," responds Fremont. Carson momentarily confers with other members of the party. What had Fremont meant, they wonder. Again, Fremont barks at Carson. "Mr. Carson, your duty." This final admonishment hangs in the air for a pregnant moment as the gravity of Fremont's command settles on Carson and his cohorts. The matter, it seems, has already been decided. Without an instant more of hesitation, Carson whirls, pistol in hand, towards the three confused and frightened men. Suddenly, the cacophony of gunfire roars out along the narrow strip of coastline. At almost the same instant, 20-year-old Ramon de Haro falls to the ground, mortally wounded. Before he is able to fully comprehend what is happening, Francisco de Haro falls, mortally wounded, as a second shot rings out from Carson's pistol. Now, as his two nephews lie on the beach rapidly expiring, the elderly Berryessa cries out in confusion and grief. His bereaved cries pierce the air until he, too, is cut down by a final shot from Carson's pistol. Moments later, all three men, who had only minutes before been paddling across the waters of the bay, all lie still in death. Fremont is, for the time being, satisfied, and Carson, for his part, seems altogether unbothered by the gruesome event. The entire affair, however brief, presents a confounding picture to both contemporary observers and to those viewing the events through the lens of posterity. While it might seem clear to most that Fremont's vainglorious nature provided the catalyst for the murders of three innocent citizens, Carson's lack of hesitation or consternation has been a cause for much confusion. While many might attribute his actions to racial motives, Carson was himself married to a Mexican citizen named Josefa Jaramillo, whom he was fiercely devoted to, and had even converted to Catholicism in order to marry. The couple had several children who were not only of mixed blood, but mixed culture, being raised in the inexorable cultural milieu of Santa Fe, the couple's lifelong home. Carson also had been married previously to two different Native American women, one of whom had borne him children. Suffice to say, racial prejudices were likely not the driving force in Carson's cold-blooded executions of the de Haro twins and the elderly Berryessa. Nor was Carson party to the fits of jingoistic fervor that so often enraptured his cohorts and countrymen. Though certainly a proud American citizen and at least a tacit adherent to the doctrine of manifest destiny, Carson did not possess an overt passion for the expansion of his country at any and all costs. To Carson, the West was a real place, alive with cultures, conflicts, commodities, and compromise, not an abstract notion that could be conquered in the name of politicians and policymakers. However, with all that said, Carson was a man with an unwavering allegiance to authority. He was largely illiterate, and had not been privy to the higher education and high society that many of his superiors had been. Carson, despite his record and reputation, felt a seemingly unshakable sense of inferiority when interacting with those imbued with governmental or societal authority. Such was the case concerning his relationship with John C. Fremont. Fremont's pedigree, connections, and title carried such significant weight in Carson's mind that even questioning the officer's intentions seems to have been an essentially unthinkable affront to duty and honor. Further cementing Carson's steadfast loyalty were the events of just a few weeks prior, when Fremont had saved Carson's life on the shores of Klamath Lake. He felt, rightfully so in this case, that he owed his life to Fremont. Fremont, meanwhile, though holding Carson's skill in high regard, seems to have been more than willing to sacrifice the lives of three innocent men on the altar of revolution, and to have used Carson as a means of keeping his hands free from the stain of actual blood. Though he had spent many years building his reputation and legacy via treacherous backwoods expeditions, as well as dining room diplomacy, Fremont sees the revolution at hand against the Mexican government to be his big chance at lasting fame and fortune. He believes that without his explicit direction and assistance, the Bear Flaggers are doomed to fail against the mighty Mexican army. He also believes that this revolutionary fervor for independence can be tempered to perfectly suit the desires of the American government in fulfilling the edicts of manifest destiny. Finally, he believes that with the killing of Fowler and Cowie, the two Sonoman citizens who had been cruelly tortured and killed by Mexican guerrillas, any and all violent retribution employed against any military-aged male, with even suspected allegiance to the Mexican government, are justifiable actions completely in keeping with military norms. Whatever the why behind either man's actions, though, there is still the matter of the what exactly the men should do next. Captain de la Torre has managed to slip away, and while he is temporarily disadvantaged, he is rapidly heading south to notify his superiors in San Francisco that the Americans in and around Sonoma have now risen up and officially spilled blood in the name of their revolution. Word will soon spread south to Los Angeles, San Diego, and before long, to Mexico City. The response from the Mexican government, Fremont expects, will be swift and merciless, and will soon overrun the Bear Flag rebels. Should Fremont command his party to return to Sonoma, they will be left to wait to receive a series of sizable, relentless attacks from an opposing force with massive advantages in both numbers and firepower. Fremont finds this option unsuitable for both tactical and political reasons. Should the moment at hand not be seized, the fight for California could prove to be a much longer affair than either himself or the nation have anticipated. Thus, Fremont decides to carry on with the initial plan of attack, heading southward down the California coast. 2 weeks after the killing of the Diaro brothers and Berryessa, Fremont leads his party to Monterey. Here, he will link up with the American naval vessels that dock in the bay, and, after another inconsequential engagement with the Mexican army, continue the march southwards towards Los Angeles. It is at Los Angeles that Fremont will task Carson with his most ambitious endeavor to date. Carson is charged with taking a small party of men and making the transcontinental trek from Southern California to Washington, D.C., with the intention of delivering correspondence from Fremont directly to President James K. Polk. Carson is, for his part, enthralled with the task. He sees this as his long-awaited opportunity to finally rub elbows with the cultural and political elites whose decisions and litigations had for so long shaped his life from afar. The plan is for Carson to then lead reinforcements to Los Angeles to assist Fremont in the final stages of overtaking California from the Mexican government. He will also, by design, be able to stop off in Santa Fe to visit his beloved wife and children. However, neither Carson's plans for a transcontinental odyssey nor Fremont's plans for an easy conquest will come to fruition in quite the way that either man has planned. But for tonight, the tale of Carson's journey to meet the president, as well as that of Fremont's fight to take California and solidify his fortune and legacy, are other stories for other times. In 1827, a bedraggled group of mountain men made their way in a long train of humans and pack animals through the Mojave Desert in what is today southeastern California. As temperatures soared and water supplies dwindled, the leader of the party, Jedediah Strong Smith, hoped to make contact with the tribe who had saved him when he passed through this same territory a year ago. The tribe, who gave the desert its name, were known as the Mojave. A year before, reaching the Mojave had been Smith's saving grace. Like all mountain men expeditions, he and his company had been in search of territory that was both abundant in beaver and unclaimed by any notable military power, be that native tribes or European or Mexican officials. The world of the mountain men was steeped in cultural, national, and ethnic ambiguity. Their goal was not to destroy or subvert any of the peoples they came across, but to accumulate as many furs as possible, namely beaver pelts, and to head back east to make use of their fortunes by buying land or otherwise improving their station in American society. Jedediah Smith had come west from New York as a young man, finding his way onto an expedition out of St. Louis. He learned quickly that in order to survive in the austere and often inhospitable American West, one had to adapt quickly, think clearly, and move decisively. Or they would soon die a hard death, many miles from home. This was the world of gray, where the enemy of one's enemy was a friend until they too became an enemy. Such was the case for Jedediah Smith's beleaguered party. In the intervening year, trappers from another band based out of Taos, New Mexico, had abused and killed a number of Mojave before swiftly departing from their lands, headed west to California. The Mojave saw no difference, nor would they have any real way of telling, in the Taos party that had abused them and Smith's party, which finally found their village and dragged themselves in, begging for food, water, and fresh horses. At first, the Mojave were friendly enough, sharing and trading food and water, though refusing to part with any horses. Actually, considering the circumstances, they were pretty darn nice. Smith even ran into a Mojave man named Francisco who had worked for his expedition the year before. Francisco was friendly, but informed Smith of the Taos trappers killing his tribesmen during the last year and hanging their bodies from trees. Smith knew this was certainly not good, and beseeched Francisco to take gifts to his chief and inform him that Smith and his party had no intention of committing any such acts, and only hoped to resupply and move on westward. The Mojave, for their part, seemed willing enough to help. They helped the trappers resupply and gave them fresh mounts, even provided grass canoes so the trappers could more easily cross the Colorado River with their belongings. The mountain men were exceedingly grateful for the help and seemingly unaware of any danger. But when they were halfway across the river, the Mojave sprang their attack, attacking with a barrage of arrows, rocks, and spears. In what took only a matter of seconds, 10 men were hacked, pierced, and bludgeoned to death as their dying screams mixed with the war cries of the Mojave, the cracking of bones, and the placid rippling of the Colorado River. The attack took place with such ferocity and surprise, the 9 remaining members could only make their way as fast as possible to the other side, amidst a barrage of arrows and rocks and spears, to try and take cover. And as the Mojave hacked the 10 unfortunate trappers into pieces, and also carried off 2 native women traveling with the party, there was a momentary lull in their attack. As Smith took stock of their available weaponry, some knives, some hatchets, and 5 rifles with limited ammunition. And what must have been an agonizing few minutes of nerve-rattling silence, the men lashed knives to the longest, straightest branches they could find, double-checked the shot in their rifles, and unsheathed their hatchets in anticipation of the close, bloody conflict to come. Smith wrote in his diary that he had reassured his men that they would in fact survive the attack that was soon to come. But, he confided, he did not actually believe this was possible. However, he remained cool, and after allowing the oncoming Mojave to charge within rifle range, ordered a volley to be shot into their midst. 2 Mojaves were killed outright. It was never the custom of any native tribe to sacrifice large numbers of warriors to gain a victory or a position, and accordingly, the Mojave broke their attack and retreated to the safety of the village. This afforded the trappers a chance to slip out into the desert and head west from near today's Needles, California, to today's San Fernando Valley. Here, they were found and cared for by a local California rancher. Then, they set about their way north through the San Joaquin Valley, in hopes of meeting with a group that they had left there the year before. From here, near the present-day city of Modesto, they were to continue northward on a journey that would see them survive inclement weather, hostile European powers, and, on another perhaps even more terrifying occasion, an attack at the hands of the Umpqua tribe. Smith would go on to survive that trip, make it all the way back to the yearly rendezvous in Wyoming, and even tried to retire in St. Louis. But soon, the trail would call him again, and at the age of 33, Jedediah Smith would be murdered on the Cimarron River by a band of the notoriously ruthless Comanche. His story is perhaps the greatest unknown odyssey in American history,
But that is a story that will have to wait for another time.
Northern California, January 24th, 1848. On this chilly morning in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains, James W. Marshall was heading a crew of local workmen in building a sawmill for Swiss immigrant and local entrepreneur John Sutter. That morning, as he walked along the American River that ran below the mill, he noticed some shiny specks in the water. Marshall reached in and plucked a few out of the frigid current to examine them more closely. Marshall prided himself on having at least a base working knowledge of minerals and knew that if, by some odd, unforeseen turn of fortune, it were gold, that it would be malleable. Marshall, born in 1810 in New Jersey, had come to California to start his own ranch. He had counted on California being annexed from Mexico, which had just recently happened in the Treaty of Hidalgo of 1848, which ended the Mexican-American War and ceded Alta, or Upper California, to the United States. He had come to this place just east of present-day Sacramento, and the rolling foothills which turned into the peaks of the Sierra Nevada mountains, and sought employment with Johann Sutter. He eventually saved up enough to get his own property, but fell on hard times and was again working for Sutter, still intent on making his own fortune, but unsure how he ever would. But he figured it was worth a shot to at least bash the shiny nuggets he had found between two rocks. If they broke, which they likely would, they wouldn't be gold, but most likely pyrite, and he could go on back to his job like any other day. But the pieces didn't break. They could be beaten together and molded into shapes. This, Marshall was now sure, was gold. He took it to his boss, Johann Sutter, and the two went to a nearby town where further tests were conducted to confirm the men's hopeful suspicions. These two confirmed that what Marshall had found that morning on the American River was indeed gold, and California was going to change forever. Towns from San Francisco to San Diego were emptied almost overnight, as hordes of people made their way to the Sierra foothills. While word took months to reach the East Coast, it sparked a near instantaneous outbreak of gold fever, sending many a young American into a frenzied scavenger hunt to acquire money, passage, equipment, or all of the above. And while it's a common misconception that the gold rush was a strictly American phenomenon, word of gold in California spread worldwide, reaching some places like Mexico, Chile, and Australia before it ever even got to New York City. Ships crowded the harbor in San Francisco, as immigrants turned miners crowded rapidly into the city, just long enough to flood the local businesses with money and construct shoddy, improvised wooden buildings that caught fire constantly. But before most buildings could even manage to burn to the ground, the new Californians were rapidly on their way east, to the gold fields. Many had made harrowing journeys, and many who had begun those journeys did not live to see California, much less make it to the gold fields. They came from the East Coast, from the South, from the Midwest, from cities large and small, and backgrounds rich and poor. They came from Mexico, Chile, Venezuela, Argentina, Hawaii, then known as the Sandwich Islands, Australia, New Zealand, China, Canada, France, England, Germany, Russia, Italy, Sweden, and Portugal, just to name a few. The estimates are around 300,000 people in total, all in a mad dash for cash, or gold, which, to say the least, took its toll on California's infrastructure, on its native tribes, on its geology, and even topography, as the course of entire rivers would be altered and entire tribes displaced. The ubiquitous hulking grizzly bear, so numerous and pervasive in California that they put it on the flag, would be eradicated from the state entirely in less than 75 years. But this was a uniquely equitable opportunity at the time, one that afforded untold fortune to those who were willing and able to pry gold from the earth's insistent grip. For essentially all of those present, this was an all-or-nothing proposition, an opportunity to get rich or die trying. Thus, there was no time, they rationalized in their fervor, to be concerned with anything outside of the acquisition and accumulation of gold. To modern sentiments, this may seem a harshly pragmatic or destructively capitalistic notion, but one must understand the undeniable and brutal facts that life was hard and people were poor, and gold could prove a quick remedy to both of those conundrums. As the droves of miners, almost entirely men aged 20 to 40, poured into the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, they concluded journeys more harrowing than most had ever experienced in their lives. Most Americans arrived via one of two routes, either on ship leaving from the East Coast and heading all the way down and around South America and Cape Horn, and, of course, the overland routes like the Oregon Trail. And both took months. And getting there was less than half the battle. There was still lots of work to be done. The luckier or more thoughtful prospector was equipped with a shovel and a gold pan. Some techniques, such as sluice boxes, where dirt would be dumped into a mesh screen and washed and sifted while looking for gold, would make the process slightly more economical, but largely their days were spent hunched over, ankle deep in cold water, sifting pan after pan of rocky sediment, hour after hour, day after day, moving tons of rock, silt, soil, and sand. Temperatures in the foothills could shift and swing wildly, blazing hot days leading into freezing cold nights. Food was whatever was cooked, often eaten out of cast iron pans on tree stumps. Work would continue throughout the seasons as men came and went, and dreams were made and, far more often, broken. The real money lay in supplying the prospector with all the essentials that he would need. Countless fortunes were made selling prospecting equipment and much appreciated and often exorbitantly priced hot meals. After a full day in a frigid stream sifting through rocks, many a man was more than happy to pay 3, 4, even 10 times the going normal rate for routine services and minimal luxuries. Law enforcement, sanitation, and civil services were all but non-existent. Many a quarrel over a gambling debt, a drunken insult, or gold claim resulted in a death at the end of a revolver or the blade of a knife. Justice was as ad hoc and swift as the construction of the shanty towns over which it presided. Vigilante groups hung so many criminals in today's Placerville that it was first known as Hangtown. Though really, it's a beautiful place, quite wonderful in the autumn, but I digress. As the hundreds of thousands of miners combed through the gold fields, they quickly learned that life spent in search of a quick way out often ended up in more work and worse conditions than they were used to in the first place. And while some did manage to strike it rich, many, through either choice or necessity, moved on to settle the wild new state. The gold rush left an indelible mark on the legacy of California, giving it its noted pioneer heritage, its nickname, and of course, providing the inspiration for the name behind the team. Joe Montana led to 4 Super Bowl titles while also becoming the first 3-time Super Bowl MVP, the San Francisco 49ers. And that is how California started. Well, not really. It's how the state of California was founded. Before it was ceded to the U.S., Alta California was home to hundreds of indigenous tribes, as well as a people known as the Californios, immigrants of Spanish settlers who had occupied California for centuries by the mid-1800s. They lived lives of infamous opulence and leisure, and their influence is seen everywhere in California, from names of the cities like Los Angeles, San Clemente, San Luis Obispo, San Diego, Modesto, Monterrey, only to name a few. They were fascinating characters whose men were unmatched on horseback and whose women unmatched on the dance floor. But that is another story for another time. Tonight's episode, Hell in the High Sierras, the Donner Party. February 18th, 1847, Truckee Lake, California. After 2 weeks traveling east through the rugged Sierra Nevada mountains and freezing temperatures, 7 men rode into a clearing near the eastern shore of the isolated mountain lake. They were a rescue party, sent out after a member of this group, a man by the name of William Eddy, had made a harrowing journey to the Sacramento Valley from this camp in order to contact the outside world and muster a rescue force.
Now, as these men approached the camp, they began to call out for any survivors. At first, their cries were met with a deafening and chilling silence. A member of the rescue party, Daniel Rhodes, gave an account of what happened next. We crossed Truckee Lake on ice and came to the spot where we had been told we should find the immigrants. We looked all around, but no living thing except ourselves was in sight, and we thought that all must have perished. We raised a loud halloo, and then we saw a woman emerge from a hole in the snow. As we approached her, several others made their appearance in like manner, coming out of the snow. They were gaunt with famine, and I never can forget the horrible, ghastly sight they presented. The first woman spoke in a hollow voice, very much agitated, and said, "Are you men from California, or do you come from heaven?" The people at this remote camp, many of them children, had endured unthinkable things. Many people today think they know the story of the Donner Party, a small group of unfortunate, foolhardy settlers who suffered the wages of their miscalculations by eating each other. It's seen as a story of misfortune, endurance, and ultimately survival. And while all those things might be true in part, in whole, what the tale of the Donner Party is a horror story. See, many also think the party were ultimately found and rescued by fearless mountain men. This, too, is true in part, but it's not the whole story. This initial group of 7 rescuers would be known to history as the First Relief, and they would be just the beginning of the last terrible chapter for those pitiable souls stuck at that lake in the middle of nowhere. But how did they get stuck there in the first place? The Donner Party was actually a collection of families, composed of men, women, children, and all their livestock and belongings, along with a number of single men that had hired on as help to drive the wagons and animals. The party was 87 people in total, more than half of which were children. They had originated as the Donner family, headed by husband George Donner and wife Tamsin Donner. With them were their 3 daughters, Frances, age 6, Georgia, age 4, Eliza, age 3, and George's daughters from a previous marriage, Elitha, 14, and Leanna, 12. George's younger brother, Jacob, 56, also joined the party with his wife, Elizabeth, 45, Isaac, age 6, Louis, age 4, and Samuel, age 1. Also traveling with the Donner brothers were Teamsters Hiram O. Miller, Samuel Shoemaker, Noah James, Charles Berger, John Denton, and Augustus Spitzer. They were joined by the Reed family, Margaret, age 32, stepdaughter Virginia, age 13, daughter Martha Jane, age 8, sons James and Thomas, age 5 and 3, and Sarah Keyes, Margaret Reed's mother. The Reed family was led by James Reed, who will prove to be a seminal figure in this story. Reed was a relatively well-off furniture maker from Illinois with a fiery temper, but a penchant for leadership. Unfortunately, Reed did not have a penchant for transcontinental navigation. He had read a book by a man named Lansford Hastings that advised those en route to California via the now famous Oregon Trail route to take a cutoff through the deserts of Utah and Nevada. There were 3 major problems with this idea, though. 1, Hastings had never actually taken the route himself. He had just studied a few maps and deduced it to be a more expedient route than the one many tribes and mountain men had trodden in some form or fashion for centuries. He was so confident in his route, Hastings published a book advising people to take it. 2, the area they went through was completely desolate, unforgiving desert, and they were woefully under-equipped and inept in the environment. And 3, it, in fact, would later be found to be about 140 miles longer than the original route. So it wasn't a shortcut at all. But, against the advice of their mountain man guide and the rest of their wagon train, the Reeds, Donners, and a number of others that they had convinced to go with them, including Lavanna Murphy, a widow from Tennessee, who headed a family of 13, Harriet Murphy Pike and her husband William M. Pike joined the party, and their daughters Naomi and Catherine also joined. Most of these kids are between the ages of 1 and 5 years old. The aforementioned William H. Eddy, a carriage maker from Illinois, had brought his wife Eleanor and their 2 children James and Margaret. The Breen family consisted of Patrick Breen, a farmer hailing from Iowa, his wife Margaret, and their 7 children. And finally, there was the Kesebergs, Louis and his wife Elizabeth Philippine, and their son Louis Jr. Nearly immediately, the divergent group faced innumerable and seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Water was nowhere to be found, rations were sparse, and the landscape was not conducive at all to travel by wagon. The livestock often wandered off in search of food and water, and the routes initially proposed in either Hastings' book or by Reed himself were often impassable and had to be retraced. Numerous party members died along this trail, but the vast majority survived. However, compounding their leadership problems and splintering factions even further, by the time they reached the Sierra Nevadas, James Reed had been banished from the party. Reed had stabbed another man, John Schneider, in either the throat, chest, or stomach, according to different eyewitness accounts, during an altercation, bleeding the man out within seconds into the parched desert sands. In this land far removed from constitutional jurisdiction, the rest of the party were unsure what to do with Reed. Some suggested hanging him, but instead, they settled for banishing him from the party to make his way alone to California. Though this was in many ways a tacit death sentence, Reed would make his way over the Sierras and ultimately prove a saving grace to his family and estranged travel companions, though one could certainly be forgiven for pointing out that this whole situation may well be blamed on Reed and his ego in the first place. Now essentially leaderless, the party continued their ascent into the Sierras. The entire group held a palpable air of anxiety, knowing that they had been long delayed. That anxiety soon rose to terror, as one morning the party awoke to a truly terrifying sight: snow on the Sierra mountaintops. It had come early this year and rendered the Donner Party narrowly but fatally outside the window of opportunity to cross the nearly impassable Sierras with even a modicum of assurance that they would emerge alive on the other side. Still, there was little else to do but make a desperate push to get through, hopefully before conditions got even worse. But things got worse. Worse in a way that no one on record had ever experienced before. The native tribes of the area knew better than to undertake such a fatal errand, but even they did not fully know just how bad the high Sierras were in the winter, at least not for any extended period of time. There was just no reason for anyone to ever be up there, they figured. And they were right. Soon, the party would be snowed in at Truckee Lake. They would construct small cabins, with each family forming small mini-camps within a few miles of each other. They would ration their food, dress their children as warmly as they could, and do their best to keep fires burning by continually venturing out to collect wood. That winter would be unusually harsh, not so much for its duration, but for its intensity. Snowstorm after snowstorm pounded the area, with more than 20 feet of snowfall being estimated to have fallen. If you go to the campsite today, you can see old trees seemingly inexplicably cut off 20 feet in the air. These were where the Donner Party had cut them down. As with so much snow, only 2 to 3 feet of the enormous trunk would have remained visible to them. Ship's logs from San Francisco and Morro Bays note snow on the mountaintops that surrounded their coastal enclaves. The vast majority of those who died were men aged 18 to 39, followed by women in the same age group, as they died desperately searching for ways to keep their children alive. When they ran out of meat, they boiled bones. When they ran out of bones, they cut strips of ox hide and boiled those until a flavorless goo could be extracted. The children would be lined up and a spoonful placed in each of their mouths as they did their best not to reflexively gag up the only nourishment they had. They planned to hunker down here and wait out the worst of the Sierra winter. But whether they perished in the cold that year or made it out alive to the Sacramento Valley, only to be haunted for the remainder of their days, for every single person at Truckee Lake, the winter of 1846 would not end in their lifetime. Because soon, there would be no more ox hide left to boil. no more food left to eat. And soon, people would begin to succumb to these ironically hellish conditions. Then, starving people would be confronted with two choices: do the unthinkable or die. It would ultimately take 2 months and 4 total rescue parties to retrieve anyone who had managed to survive that winter. Each trip required the party, whose motives also included rescuing the valuable goods left by the Donner Party's deceased, to scale thousands of feet in elevation at great peril to themselves. And each time a party arrived to bring more people out and more snow thawed, more and more of what had happened that terrible winter became apparent. By the time the 4th Rescue Party, or 4th Relief, arrived in April of 1847, the macabre scene that greeted them rivaled anything modern horror cinema has ever even come close to. Wandering their way through the camp searching for any valuables or survivors, they were first greeted with the horrible stench of flesh that had begun to putrefy in the warming weather. They came across the body of a young woman, slashed open and denuded of fatty tissue at the breast, with arms missing large strips of flesh that had been deliberately filleted off. Her skull had been cracked open at the top, and all the brain tissue had been scooped out. 2 more heads were found in similar condition. Then another body, this one of Mrs. Donner, lying similarly butchered but identifiable. Then they came across the cabin of Louis Kesselberg. The following is an eyewitness account given by one Captain Fallon, who was the first to lay eyes on Kesselberg that day. Upon entering, discovered Kesselberg lying down amidst the human bones, and beside him a large pan full of fresh liver and lights. They asked him what had become of his companions, whether they were alive, and what had become of Mrs. Donner. He answered them by stating that they were all dead. Mrs. Donner, he said, had, in attempting to cross from one cabin to another, missed the trail and slept out one night. That she came to his camp the next night very much fatigued. He made her a cup of coffee, placed her in bed, and rolled her well in the blankets, but the next morning found her dead. They asked Kesselberg if the contents of the frying pan in his cabin were indeed the liver and brains of Mrs. Donner. Kesselberg replied enthusiastically that they were. When his interrogators asked why he did not eat the bit of beef that the 3rd rescue party had left him, actually James Reed had left it for him, he came back, bathed Kesselberg, combed his hair, and gave him some food to hold him over until this last 4th Relief could come and rescue him. Kesselberg replied that it was not nearly as sweet as human meat, and the liver was the tastiest bit of human of all, not to be skipped in favor of boring, old, too dry beef. Kesselberg was ultimately rescued and returned to society to live an ostracized existence, though the rest of the survivors were not harshly shamed, as they were seen to have taken no glee in what they were forced to do. Another cleanup party of sorts would come in the months later after the 4th Relief. They would dig a huge pit in the middle of one of the cabins, put all of the earthly pieces of the unfortunate souls who had perished here on this lonely shore into it, and burn it all to ashes. They hoped, with the last of the smoke and embers, to extinguish as best they could the horrific memories of what had happened in this place. But they would not. Today, in the campsite where so much horror occurred, there is a museum and a monument to what occurred there in the winter of 1846. And, of course, Truckee Lake, upon whose shores the desperate party had sought refuge and endured something as close to hell as almost any human beings in history, is no longer Truckee Lake. Today, it's known as Donner Lake. Now, what we've covered tonight is but a small slice of the entire story of the Donner Party. There's the stories of James Reed and his multiple desperate attempts to save his family. There's the equally harrowing and horrifying tale of the Forlorn Hope, the group who set out from the Donner camp in search of rescue. There's the stories of the lives the survivors lived and the traumas they dealt with or at times succumbed to. All are tales worthy of their own episodes. But for tonight, those are stories for another time.
Monterey, California, March 6, 1846. As a cool wind whips over their position atop a high mountain peak, John C. Fremont looks down upon the amassing forces of Mexican Army troops with equal parts disdain and trepidation. Above him, attached to a long fallen tree branch turned into a makeshift flagpole, the American flag flutters in the breeze. Every man atop this Northern California mountain peak knows that their presence here is already tantamount to trespassing, and that Fremont's insistence on climbing to their current position and then raising the American flag is an explicit and obvious declaration of war against the ruling Mexican government. Fremont, already a national celebrity for his accomplishments as an explorer and military man, has climbed to his current location with his force of 60 American soldiers, sailors, and frontiersmen in hopes of making a stand against the vastly superior forces of the Mexican Army deep in the heart of California territory. As word spreads to Mexican officials in the surrounding territories, the open fields in the valleys below the mountain begin to fill with more and more Mexican troops and local volunteers. Meanwhile, atop the peak, Fremont has ordered the construction of a makeshift timber fort in order to create some measure of bulwark defense against the overwhelming attack to come. As his men hack down trees and dig post holes into the dense, dark mountain soil, Fremont is confronted with the increasingly stark reality of his and his men's situation. The mood amongst the Americans is tense, and speech amongst the men is terse and unsure. Many see their present circumstances as all too reminiscent of the infamous 1836 Battle of the Alamo, in which 180 brave Texans had perished in a valiant but incredibly brutal last stand, which had cost every one of them their lives. Now, many among the Americans atop the high Northern California peak fear that they, too, will meet a similar fate. They are, in point of fact, trespassers in a foreign land, here under the false and transparently flimsy pretext that they are merely wayward American explorers, who simply happened upon this territory while on a quest to survey the whole of the United States' rightful territory. In reality, however, Fremont and his men are on what amounts to a scouting mission for the United States government, who, in 1846, has increasingly explicit interests in seizing the territory comprising northern Mexico known as Alta California. Already known nationwide as the Pathfinder, Fremont views himself as perhaps the preeminent agent of the American concept of manifest destiny, the notion that a continent-spanning nation is the ultimate end, an undeniable right of the still relatively new country. John Charles Fremont had been born in Savannah, Georgia in 1813. His father was a French-Canadian schoolteacher, and his mother the youngest daughter of a prominent Virginia plantation owner. After his father's tragic passing in 1818, the family had moved to Charleston, South Carolina, where the precocious young Fremont obtained his early education from a local lawyer by the name of John W. Mitchell. Fremont had briefly attended Charleston College, studying mathematics and natural sciences, before being expelled in 1831 for lack of attendance. While teaching mathematics in the local countryside, however, Fremont had earned the praises of prominent local politician Joel R. Poinsett, a rabid Jacksonian Democrat who was able to leverage his influence to secure Fremont a position teaching mathematics aboard the USS Natchez, a U.S. naval sloop which sailed the seas around South America in 1833. Fremont's tenure on the seas would be short-lived, however, as he soon left this position to accept an appointment as second lieutenant with the U.S. Topographical Corps. Here, he worked surveying a route for the Charleston, Louisville, and Cincinnati Railroad. It was during this time that Fremont's true interest in exploration and map-making was piqued. A stint working in the Carolina mountains only served to solidify his desire to become an explorer, and between 1837 and 1838, he served on a reconnaissance detail in Georgia in preparation for the United States government's removal of the Cherokee tribe from the area. In March of 1837, Fremont's former mentor Joel R. Poinsett was appointed as Secretary of War under President Martin Van Buren. With his new powers of office, Poinsett arranged for Fremont to accompany French scientist and explorer Joseph Nicolet in his exploration of the territory between the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. Serving under Nicolet, Fremont built a reputation as a revered topographer, adept in astronomy, geology, the description of local flora and fauna, as well as being possessive of an inquisitive and ambitious nature. In 1841, he married Jessie Benton, the daughter of Thomas Hart Benton, a Missouri politician and chairman of the Senate Committee on Military Affairs. Thomas Benton had initially refused the 28-year-old Fremont's request for his daughter's hand in marriage, arguing that the young man was not part of American high society and thus not a fitting match for his 16-year-old daughter. However, the couple eventually eloped, and while initially irate at the news, the bride's father eventually warmed to the marriage and to his new son-in-law. A die-hard expansionist and devotee of manifest destiny, Thomas Benton soon advocated for the necessity of sending survey teams west to scout potential transcontinental routes that could facilitate the large numbers of people they believed would soon be flooding into the untouched reaches of the continent. Benton also insisted that his son-in-law, John C. Fremont, was the only acceptable man to place in charge of these exploratory expeditions, with his combination of academic training, real-world experience, and political connections. Beginning in 1842, Fremont had led 3 expeditions. The first began in the summer of 1842, with an exploration of the budding Oregon Trail, following the South Pass that legendary mountain man Jedediah Smith had pioneered through the Rocky Mountains a generation earlier. They returned to Washington in October, and both John and Jessie Fremont soon rose to national renown with their published account of Fremont's expedition, entitled A Report of the Exploring Expedition to the Rocky Mountains, which became a nationwide success virtually overnight, stirring the restless imaginations of countless readers with its accounts of the Rocky Mountains, the Great Plains, and the various peoples, plants, and animals that inhabited the area. The unfettered success of Fremont's first expedition soon saw him appointed to his second, this one charging him with leading another expedition to South Pass, but this time pushing beyond it in a search of a route to the Pacific. This second expedition was equally as successful as the first, if not more so, as Fremont completed the transcontinental journey from Washington to present-day Sacramento, and then back to St. Louis in August of 1844. From here, his account of his second expedition was sent to publication, and in Washington, both the Senate and the House ordered 10,000 copies each. With the success of Fremont's first 2 expeditions, the 1845 election of James K. Polk as president, and continually rising tensions between the United States and Mexico in regards to the territory west of the Mississippi River and north of the Rio Grande, a third expedition was commissioned in 1845. However, this trip, while still being conducted under the auspices of a mere exploration, was planned with far more militaristic ends in mind. Fremont was again placed in charge, and this time specifically commissioned by the War Department to survey the central ranges of the Rocky Mountains, the Great Salt Lake Basin, and the central ranges of the Sierra Nevada Range, with the end goal of ascertaining the strength of the Mexican military in these areas, mapping and recording potential routes of ingress and egress for American military forces, and to determine the loyalty of the local citizenries to the Mexican government. This third expedition had struck out from St. Louis on June 1st of 1845. They traveled west, passing through Bent's Fort and by the Great Salt Lake. When the party reached the Ogden River, today known as the Humboldt River, Fremont divided the men into 2 groups in hopes of doubling his effectiveness in surveillance by covering more ground in more directions. With 16 men, Fremont had arrived at Sutter's Fort, near present-day Sacramento, on December 9th, 1845. Here, he did his utmost to incite an air of patriotic fervor amongst the American expatriates who now called the area home. In the preceding decades, many of the peoples who called Northern California home had built a growing resentment towards the Mexican government, who tended to treat the citizens of Alta California as dismissible inhabitants of an expansive, wild, and altogether unknowable territory that merited little, if any, attention from officials whose constituents and concerns were situated almost entirely around the capital of Mexico City and its surrounding areas. little in the way of formal official backing, Fremont had promised the aggrieved inhabitants of Sutter's Fort and the surrounding areas that, should they muster a rebellion against their oppressors in the Mexican government, he would ensure they had the full backing and support of the United States government. From Sutter's Fort, Fremont and his small party made their way west to the coastal town of Monterey, where Fremont met with American Consulate Thomas O. Larkin and the official Mexican Comandante, Jose Castro. Here, Fremont managed to simultaneously request replenishments of his supplies, while all the while surreptitiously continuing to survey the area for offensive strengths, defensive vulnerabilities, and local morale. By February of 1846, the party of 45 men who had separated from the original group to survey further north had reunited with Fremont and his group of 16 men at Mission San Jose, just north of Monterey. But the increased size of Fremont's contingent of Americans, as well as the duration of their stay, soon drew the suspicion of Comandante Jose Castro, who eventually ordered that Fremont and his men exit the whole of the Alta California territory. But, rather than acquiesce to the lawful order, Fremont had decided that he and his men would make their stand here, and lay claim to American soil that Fremont believed to be rightfully and providentially theirs. And so now, as word spreads through the nearby ranchos and small towns that a group of Americans had laid claim to Mexican territory in a direct provocation of their local government, Fremont and his men hunker down for the vicious battle to come. Ammunition is plentiful but finite, and with a total force of only 61 men, it is obvious to all that, even with their position atop this high ground, the Americans are not prepared to withstand a prolonged assault. Their nearest infantry reinforcements are hundreds of miles away, and their naval reinforcements practically non-existent here on the Alta California coast. The growing unease amongst the men with their current circumstances leads one amongst them to finally speak up. But this man is no rank-and-file member of the American force. He is, in point of fact, the real driving force behind Fremont's expeditionary successes thus far. His name is Christopher Houston Carson, better known as Kit Carson. Having already spent a decade of his life surviving the continent's harshest environs, few names on the American frontier garner as much reverence and recognition as his. While Fremont has indeed earned his reputation as a tireless explorer, it is Carson who has provided the experience, insight, and essential skills to facilitate that ambition and wanderlust. While politicians in Washington, D.C. could only pontificate on what the vast expanses of the largely unknown frontier might possess, Carson was already long familiar with the territories, landmarks, weather, wildlife, and native tribes that only a handful of Americans had ever even heard of. While barely literate and possessing none of the requisite pedigree of Washington officials, Carson is a master trapper, tracker, tanner of hides, horseman, sharpshooter, navigator, linguist, negotiator, and could build or break down a campsite in mere minutes. He was fleet of foot on the trail, cool under pressure in a fight, and unwavering in his allegiance to his own personal code of honor and ethics. Only a few years prior, at the annual Mountain Man Rendezvous in present-day Wyoming, Carson had challenged a drunken and belligerent Frenchman to a pistol duel on horseback, after he found out the man had publicly affronted one too many trappers and accosted a number of the attending women. The duel had ended with Carson coolly riding towards his opponent before loosing a ball from his pistol that shattered the man's wrist, resulting in his forfeiting the duel. Word of Carson's reputation as not only a skilled trapper, but a man not to be trifled with, had spread far and wide, and by the time he crossed paths with one John C. Fremont, Fremont was well aware of his reputation. The two had met while traveling on a steamboat up the Missouri River, and Fremont had convinced Carson to accompany his expedition and lend them his valuable skills. Time and again in the preceding years, Carson's know-how and wherewithal had been the prevailing cause behind the entire expedition's survival against dire odds. Not at all unaware of Carson's necessity in his successes, Fremont began to include effusive praise for his vaunted guide in the correspondence he sent back to Washington. Once, When report came to their group that a war party of Pawnee warriors were scouring the area, Carson had leapt on his horse, without even pausing to saddle the animal, and, with only rifle in hand and a knife in his belt, ridden off over the rolling prairie hills in order to scout the area for threats. Fremont recounted, quote, "Mounted on a fine horse without a saddle and scouring bareheaded over the prairies, Kit was one of the finest pictures of a horseman I have ever seen." End quote. Soon, these sentiments became part of the national conversation, as Carson's reputation as a sort of frontier superhero spread from the expanses of the prairies to the pages of dime novels and newspapers, eagerly devoured by readers in cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. But Kit Carson, for all his vaunted courage and newfound national acclaim, is no fool. Though he is a flawed man as any, he is not vain, nor concerned with his legacy or his own country's expansion to the extent that he is willing to risk the almost certain deaths of himself and his comrades purely in the name of jingoistic fervor. Carson and the rest of the men atop the mountain believe their task to be increasingly futile with every passing hour, as numbers of Mexican soldiers in the fields below them increase from dozens to hundreds, their leadership and rank and file alike rightfully indignant at the Americans' arrogant and ill-advised occupation of their land. Thomas O. Larkin, the American consulate, himself supports Jose Castro's order for Fremont to vacate the Alta California territory. With years of tensions between Mexico and America already festering, Larkin had become increasingly worried that Fremont's actions would spark the tinderbox of already tenuous relations between the two countries. Now, it seems that bloodshed is inevitable. For their part, the California citizens as well take great offense at the incursion of this force of what are effectively foreign spies in their homeland. Though long neglected by the Mexican government, as they had been under its predecessor in the Spanish government, the Californios are a fiercely independent people, comprised largely of ranchers, farmers, and vaqueros, who carve out livings from the land's abundance while tending to the hostile local tribes, corrupt government officials, and, of course, the hulking California grizzly bears that populate the state in great numbers. They are master horsemen, adept in not only extraordinary feats of riding, but in wielding their long leather riatas in combination with elongated, steel-tipped lances. Though the tactic may appear comically antiquated at first to an enemy force wielding pistols and rifles, the California forces have perfected the technique of roping enemy combatants from their horses, at which point their lance-wielding comrades ride in to dispatch the unfortunate man. For their part, the massing Mexican military forces under the command of Comandante Castro are underfunded, under-equipped, and perpetually undermanned. Here on the fringes of Mexico's northernmost territories, they receive little in the way of formal direction or support. However, with the American flag now flying above their mountain peak, their directive is clear: force the Americans to leave at any cost. As rosters are composed and equipment is cleaned and checked amongst the Mexican forces, the consensus amongst Fremont's men, argued foremost by Kit Carson himself, is that there will be no honor to be had in the rout that is to come. They are under no illusions that the sacrifice of their lives will go on to uphold or inspire a revolution against the presiding Mexican government, as it had in Texas with the Battle of the Alamo. Instead, they assume that they will simply be wiped out, left as nothing more than a curious footnote in history as a band of impetuous madmen who had attempted to overthrow a sitting government. However, despite the seemingly utter futility of their situation, Fremont remains unmoved. For 3 long days, despite the consternation from within his ranks, Fremont refuses to surrender his position. Finally, on the 3rd day, it is clear that the Mexican forces in the valley below have been fully assembled. Within the next day, an attack will be imminent. Many among the American men spend their evening picking at their scant rations for supper and deep in concern and anxiety for the terrors that the sunrise will bring. Now, even Fremont's resolve begins to wane. What had seemed such an ignoble and selflessly patriotic act only days earlier, now seems to be a prison of circumstance, trapping Fremont between his competing interests for glory and self-preservation. As the last vestiges of the sun's rays sink below the dark horizon of the Pacific, many among the Americans believe it to be the last sunset that they will ever see. As darkness sets in, it brings with it the nighttime chill so common to the area. For hour after fitful hour, Fremont, Carson, and the other Americans shiver restlessly under thin blankets as the wind begins to pick up throughout the night. Finally, the sunrise breaks, clear and still, and the men wake to a chilling omen. At some point during the night, the makeshift flagpole that had been erected 4 days earlier has been blown down by the swirling Bay Area winds. Now, the American flag that had flown so boldly lies sullied in the dark soil of Gavilan Peak. The consensus among the men, as the sun continues to rise, is that this final indignity to their nation's colors most assuredly does not bode well for their efforts in the battle to come. Even Fremont, who had watched the sunset without wavering in his resolve to hold the mountaintop, looks upon the soiling of their flag as a particularly bad omen. Suddenly, as the totality of his situation sets in, and the hour of attack nears for the Mexican troops massing down below them, Fremont begins to reconsider his options. He knows that he can either stand and fight, likely at the cost of his own life and the lives of his men, or surrender their position and retreat from the mountain peak. After a few tense minutes of consideration, Fremont finally gives the order for the Americans to strike camp and proceed down the westerly slope of Gavilan Peak. This the men readily do, with most nearly elated at having avoided the fate that had been met in San Antonio a decade earlier by men like Colonel Travis, Jim Bowie, and Davy Crockett. As the sun continues to rise and the area's notorious morning overcast begins to clear, the Mexican forces, too, are relieved to look upon the mountaintop and find it devoid of American forces. Gavilan Peak, where the American forces had made their ill-advised stand, is today known as Fremont Peak, located between the cities of Monterey and Santa Cruz, California. Fremont will go on to move his men north, heading through the northern reaches of the San Joaquin Valley before pushing on to Klamath Lake in Oregon. On the way, the expedition encountered several native tribes, and hostilities ensued, with several natives left dead and more bad will being accumulated by Fremont in the California Territory. However, Fremont, Carson, and the men of this expedition will find no respite in Oregon. Soon, they will be called back to California after being located in the middle of the wilderness by a United States Marine captain on a top-secret mission with correspondence from Washington, D.C. But before Fremont and his men can make their way south again, they will find themselves victims to a surprise attack by the Klamath tribe, who are incensed at the Americans' presence in their lands. This will cost the lives of several expedition members and result in a retributory raid with sickening consequences for the local native tribes. Though the fight for the mountaintop has been narrowly avoided, the coming Mexican-American War will only intensify in California in the coming years. But the countless tales of John C. Fremont, Kit Carson, and the other Americans who will make their way westward in the fight for American expansion in the coming years, as well as the stories of the Mexican citizens and the native tribes who sought to retain their own homelands, are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
San Diego, California, December 5th, 1846. As a dreary overcast sky looms above them, Captain Archibald Gillespie and his detachment of 40 U.S. Marines ride east from the city into the dry, chaparral-covered desert that looms endlessly before them. They are on their way to join forces with Brigadier General Stephen F. Kearny and his force of 200 troops, who have sent word to the Marines that they are caught in dire straits in the middle of the Southern California desert. General Kearny and his men have traveled to their current location, roughly 30 miles east of the bustling pueblo of San Diego, as part of the United States' efforts during the ongoing Mexican-American War. Though they have endured seemingly endless hardships on their journey from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, to the city of Santa Fe and then across the vast expanses of the deserts of present-day New Mexico and Arizona, before finally reaching the deserts of Alta California, most of the men are eager to find and engage their enemy in the Mexican army. However, General Kearny's force is still diminutive in size and thousands of miles away from their closest support to the east. Seeing the increasingly dangerous circumstances, Kearny had seen it necessary to send a rider to San Diego requesting reinforcements. This request reached the headquarters of Captain Archibald Gillespie, where he had hurriedly marshaled the contingent of U.S. Marines he now leads eastward in their effort to reach General Kearny and his men before they are forced to engage with the local forces that are surely reconnoitering the hills around them. These local forces, Gillespie and his men are well aware, are unlike the rest of their counterparts in the Mexican army, whom the U.S. forces have combated in the previous few years. With Alta or Upper California comprising the northernmost reaches of Mexican territory, its inhabitants, Mexican citizens known as Californios, have adapted their country's culture to fit their environs. In the vast expanses of Californio ranchos, which could comprise thousands of acres, becoming an adept horseman was essential not only for working vaqueros, but also everyday citizens simply wishing to get from one place to another in this expansive land. Throughout the whole of Mexico, the Californios were regarded as unmatched in not only their horsemanship, but their adroitness in wielding their long leather riatas, precursors to the modern-day cowboy's rope. It was said that a Californio would rather climb atop his horse and ride 100 yards rather than walk it, and that any Californio was a better roper with his foot than the average Mexican was with his hand. But these are not the only attributes that separate the Californio soldiers that General Kearny and his men will be facing and the regular Mexican army fighting further to the south. Their most noticeable characteristic, and perhaps their most dangerous, is evident even from afar to the scouts and soldiers watching them from the cover of the dense chaparral brush. Long, steel-tipped lances jut upward several feet from over the heads of each Californio rider, giving them an air of medieval simplicity that seems antiquated even here in the 1840s Southern California desert. But, while many among the Americans find the spectacle to be nearly comical, the damage that these lances can inflict is far from a laughing matter for anyone faced with combating them. Though the Californios are lacking in way of firearms and ammunition, their ability to inflict grievous wounds upon their adversaries before dashing away gives them a capability scarcely seen outside of the mighty tribes of the American plains, like the Cheyenne, the Lakota, and the Comanche. Against a fighting force armed with single-shot carbines, they present a formidable foe. It had been at what history has come to know as the Battle of the Old Woman's Gun, when a detachment of unfortunate U.S. Navy sailors, Marines, and civilian volunteers had attempted to march on the burgeoning city of Los Angeles in an effort to quell an uprising in the area that had been previously conquered by American forces. This detachment, composed of 310 men, had been caught by the Californios just outside of the city and made to pay dearly over the course of a battle that lasted a night and the succeeding day. During the engagement, 4 American sailors had been killed, and 6 additional men gravely wounded at the end of the Californios' lances. Captain Archibald Gillespie, for his part, has spent the previous few months clinging tenuously to any semblance of power over the city of Los Angeles, having been appointed to the post by Robert F. Stockton, with explicit orders to rule over the city with a strict eye and an unforgiving hand. But, after continued unrest from the inhabitants of the city, with some in support of the Americans' efforts and some vehemently opposed, Stockton and Gillespie retreated southward by sailing to San Diego on October 26, 1846. They arrived 5 days later, on October 31st, and were welcomed by the local inhabitants of the besieged city to take part in their celebrations of All Souls' Day. However, despite their warm reception, the men had found San Diego to be all but bereft of usable horses, mules, and cattle. While Stockton had returned north to Monterey, where Commanding Officer John C. Fremont was experiencing similar problems, Captain Gillespie and his men had set about procuring as many animals and supplies as they could while staying within the good graces of the citizens. At this critical juncture in the Mexican-American War, the Americans now found themselves clinging to largely nominal control of the Southern California coastline stretching down from San Francisco. They were running low on men, ammunition, and supplies. However, General John Kearny, on his trek westward from the desert, mistakenly believed his countrymen to have solidified a strong measure of control over nearly the whole of the territory. In the middle of the New Mexico desert, Kearny and his men had happened upon none other than the legendary mountain man Kit Carson, whom John C. Fremont had dispatched to Washington to carry correspondence regarding the Americans' progress in Alta California. After reviewing these dispatches, General Kearny had felt so hopeful as to the state of the Americans' advancement that he sent nearly half of his forces back to Santa Fe. He did, however, enlist the famed Carson to accompany him and his men back to Southern California. Now, Carson, among the most experienced in the group by far in matters of frontier warfare, rides with Kearny's cavalry, dressed in his mountain man trappings and sitting astride his sure-footed mule. He shares Kearny's growing concern with the group's isolation. The men amongst the cavalry, however, are by and large in high spirits, despite the toll taken on themselves and their animals by the months-long journey west. They have come here to fight what they believe to be a markedly inferior enemy, not only lacking in their training and equipment, but in fact relegated to using centuries-old technology in a desperate bid against a superior foe. Still, the obviousness of their predicament is not lost on the men of the cavalry, and all among them welcome the sight of Captain Gillespie and his Marines rumbling towards them in the afternoon, kicking up a sizable cloud of dust and towing with them a small brass cannon to add to the artillery firepower of the soldiers. Kearny and Carson both warmly greet Gillespie, who informs the general, much to his chagrin, that the state of affairs for the Americans in Southern California has deteriorated, even in the time since Carson has skulked out of San Diego with his secret correspondence for President James K. Polk. He also assures them that their suspicions that the Californios might be very close by are likely justified. Unfortunately for the Americans, Gillespie is more correct than he knows, as word of he and his men's departing San Diego has already reached two nearby parties of Californio Lancers. One, commanded by Leonardo Cota and Jose Alipas, is stationed at San Luis Rey to the north. When word reaches their headquarters, a contingent of Lancers immediately heads south to join forces with their brethren in order to mount an attack. Meanwhile, the second contingent of Lancer forces, commanded by Don Andres Pico, brother of the governor Pio Pico, is stationed in San Diego. Don Andres commands virtually the whole of the city outside of the American-held ports. He has now received word that the group of Marines has evaded Mexican security forces and is headed east into the desert. As yet unaware of Kearny's forces, they assume the men are yet again attempting to scour the countryside in search of horses and cattle. The two forces meet at San Luis Rey, where Pico, the senior officer, sees fit to divide their forces in an effort to more effectively scout the vast expanse of desert. Half of the men are sent south to El Cajon, while Pico and his contingent of 78 men make their way east into the desert, scouring the landscape for any sign of intruding American forces. In the late afternoon, the Californios arrive at the small Native American village of San Pasqual. The residents, largely terrified of the Californios after decades of incursion and mistreatment on their part, flee their homes, leaving their shelters to Pico and his men. But that evening, as Pico and his men cook their evening meals over the coals of the natives' fires, one of the tribespeople suddenly comes running back into the village, reporting that they have been found and detained by nearby American forces, numbering far larger than Pico had expected Captain Gillespie's force of Marines to be. Believing the natives' claims to be either lies or outright delusions, Pico largely dismisses them. However, only a few miles away, the flickering candles inside General Kearny's field headquarters tent illuminate the shadows of Kearny, Gillespie, Kit Carson, and a number of other officers as they now discuss what steps to take next, knowing that their enemy is almost certainly close at hand. It is decided that scouts will be sent out to reconnoiter the area and determine the size and strength of the Californios' forces. Lieutenant Thomas C. Hammond is appointed to command a small group of scouts, including some local natives, among them a man named Rafael Machado, who is familiar with both the tactics of the Californios as well as the terrain. In the pre-dawn hours, they ride into the countryside, disappearing into the darkness. Soon, Machado has discerned the location of the Californios at San Pasqual. He even crawls forward through the brush, garnering a close enough vantage point to confirm that these mostly sleeping men are in fact Pio's forces. But after Machado is gone for a longer time than he had planned, Lieutenant Hammond becomes anxious that the native Californio Machado has double-crossed him and alerted Pico's men to his presence. Concerned that they will be the victims of an ambush, Hammond orders the remainder of his men to follow him in a silent charge into the village. Despite the men remaining silent, the clattering of their weapons and the pounding of their horses' hooves alert the Californio sentries on watch. Machado is discovered by his companions in this charge, having in fact steadfastly done his duty, and now remounts and joins his cohorts in a hurried retreat as the Californio guards order them to halt. In their haste, one of the soldiers drops their dark blue coat, with the tag U.S. Army sewn on it. Now, not only is Pico aware of the presence of the Americans, he has evidence that there is a larger force afoot than the 39 Marines who had left San Diego. As Lieutenant Hammond breathlessly reports the news of their discovery to General Kearney, Kearney mulls over his options. He decides, against the advice of Carson, that since the element of surprise has now been lost, they must make their attack as quickly as possible. As an early morning frost coats the blankets of the sleeping men, and a thick fog covers the landscape, they are suddenly shaken awake by their officers, and told to make ready for a charge. After shaking off their restless night's sleep, many of the young men are eager to mount up and make the charge to glory that they have traveled so far to take part in. Kearney has, however, taken a number of steps in order to mitigate their risk. He has ordered that their main objective will be to surround the village of San Pasqual, capture their horses, and take the men prisoner. However, the general, Carson, and Gillespie are all dubious as to whether or not this plan will be entirely realistic. Meanwhile, the forward observers from Pico's force of Californios dot the horizon with their silhouettes, keenly gathering some rather surprising intelligence as they take stock of the number of Americans present, not so large that an attack would be out of the question, and the condition of their stock, who are now so gaunt after their cross-continental trek that many of them seem near death. Within 15 minutes of being awakened, the men are organizing into their well-drilled formations in preparation for battle. When they had first left Kansas, their companies had been arranged according to the color of their horses, their animals well-fed and energetic, the men's uniforms pressed and well-kempt, and their weapons cleaned, oiled, and ready for use. Now, many of the men ride mules or horses mismatched from their units, and the animals' current state significantly affects their ability to perform. To make matters worse, their carbines cannot be counted on to fire in the damp morning conditions. Thus, this attack will be relegated to swords and single-shot pistols, with the carbine's only use now being in wielding it as a club. The men separate into 3 guards, with the advance guard being commanded by Captain Abram R. Johnston. General Kearney commands the guard behind them, but as the men move out towards the small valley that ensconces the village of San Pasqual, they begin to separate from each other at a greater and greater rate during the course of their travel. As the men near the village, a critical mishap takes place. With the distance between them making the commands all but inaudible, General Kearney's command for Captain Johnston to proceed in a, quote, trot is misheard as a gallop. This is a grave mistake, as the distance to the village is too far for the exhausted horses to reach at full speed, and the advanced force would be too far ahead of the second column for the second column to provide adequate relief. Still, Johnston dutifully issues the order, and the men in the advanced column urge their horses into a gallop. Seeing this, General Kearney is horrified. He exclaims, "Good heavens, I did not mean that!" However, it is too late, and now the distance between the two forces grows even faster. Snapping into action, Kit Carson urges his mule into a full gallop of its own, attempting to catch up to the runaway column, as Kearney keeps his troops at a trot so as not to lose complete control of the battle before it begins. Carson and his mule catch up to the charging Captain Johnston, whose column is now reaching the expanse of the open valley floor. A half a mile away, they can see the village. The attack is now imminent. The 12-man column charges on, with its men roaring out in whoops and battle cries as they make their charge upon the village. But Pico and his Californios have taken cover in a small ravine next to the village, and from here let loose an initial volley of musket fire from their limited collection of firearms. As the gun smoke mixes with the thick fog, Captain Johnston falls from his mount, killed by a musket ball to the head. Riding directly behind him, Kit Carson sees the captain fall. This trips up his own mount, and his normally sure-footed mule takes a disastrous tumble to the ground, launching Carson several yards ahead of the animal, where he lands splayed out and in a daze, before hurriedly scrambling out of the way of the rest of the charging column. The charging soldiers attempt to loose a volley of their own, but most find that their weapons have indeed been rendered useless in the damp conditions. Now, the 11 remaining Americans draw their long sabers and charge head-on towards the Californios. At first, the Californios feign a retreat, momentarily seeming to scatter their forces to the west as they flee along the path of a small creek near the village. Captain Ben Moore, now the officer in charge with Johnston having been killed in the action, orders the men to pursue the Californios immediately. This the men do, giving chase down the banks of the small waterway. But this pursuit draws out their forces even further, making them easy targets for their enemy. As Kearny, Gillespie, and the rest of the men make their way across the valley as quickly as they can on their bedraggled mounts, they can only watch the horror that unfolds next. The Californios, seeing the compromised state of the Americans' forces, now wheel their fine, well-fed, and well-trained horses around, and make a head-on charge towards the soldiers still pursuing them. Within moments, they have surrounded the Americans in a whirling cyclone from which they can strike with their long lances, inflicting deep, grievous wounds, while others among them throw their leather riatas with expert efficiency, ensnaring and unsaddling riders who can then be pounced upon and dispatched in brutal fashion by other lance-wielding Californios. Captain Moore charges at Captain Pico himself, firing off an errant shot from his single-shot pistol before drawing his saber. He engages Pico, an expert swordsman, who manages to slash Moore with his own saber. As Moore attempts to fight off Pico's sword slashes and thrusts, 2 of Pico's men make separate charges upon the American officer, driving their lances deep into his torso and eventually sending him crumbling to the ground. The fall breaks the blade of Moore's saber, leaving him only the handle of the weapon with which to defend himself. He crawls to a spot near the river, attempting to club and bash any Californio who comes near, but he is soon finished off by a Californio with a pistol. Now, more Americans are starting to arrive at the battlefield, including General Kearny and Captain Gillespie. As he fights, Kearny is viciously wounded by a lance that pierces his lower back. Gillespie fights off numerous vociferous attacks directed at him by a number of attacking lancers, many of whom know who he is and are intent on exacting vengeance upon him personally. For his part, Kit Carson has managed to obtain one of the carbines from the dead U.S. soldiers, one that he miraculously finds to be in working order. He now sits ensconced behind a small rock formation, proffering effective, lethal fire against any Californio who comes within range of his position. Finally, the brass cannons being towed towards the rear of the third column are brought to the field by the American forces, and a powerful volley is let loose towards the Californios. Though it has little effect in the way of lethality, it does manage to momentarily scatter Pico's forces. Now, as Pico and his men survey the battlefield from out of range of the cannons, they are overwhelmed with a collective joy at not only having survived, but tactically dominated a better trained, better equipped, and much larger opposition force. For their part, General Kearny, Captain Gillespie, and Kit Carson are now left to survey a macabre scene of death and gore that seems to cover the whole of the valley floor. They are now trapped here, with many dead and many wounded, still 30 miles from the nearest friendly forces in San Diego, and with Pico and his Californios now stalking the hills all around them in order to cut off any route of escape. During the night, the men who are uninjured go about the grisly task of digging a large communal grave for their comrades, before laying their bodies down inside of it, covering them up, and walking their horses over the top to tamp down the ground to keep their comrades' bodies safe from the frothing packs of hungry wolves that now seem to fill the valley, having smelled the blood and viscera that now litter its floor. In the next few days, the Californios will take great hope in their ability to perhaps defend themselves from the encroaching American forces after so many months of doubt. They will hound General Kearny's forces, making any likelihood of their escape to San Diego, especially with many wounded in tow, nearly impossible. It will ultimately be up to Kit Carson, as well as a native guide and a naval officer, who will volunteer to make a death-defying nighttime trek to San Diego in hopes of garnering relief forces for their comrades. But the story of Kit Carson and his comrades' impossible task, and the conclusion of the brutal, bloody, and callous Mexican-American War are, for tonight, other stories for other times. San Diego, California, December 8, 1846. In the middle of the night, in the desert 30 miles east of the city, Kit Carson, legendary American mountain man, lies face down in the dirt, not moving a muscle, and doing his best to slow his breathing. Mere yards away, a Mexican soldier on sentry duty sits atop his fine California horse, coolly smoking a cigaretto and enjoying a brief moment of relaxation and solitude in the middle of the Southern California desert. Carson knows that should this soldier discover his location, he and his 2 comrades will assuredly be taken prisoner and likely executed. Still, as Carson grits his teeth, the soldier remains blissfully unaware of any enemy presence, merely enjoying his cigarette, filling the air around himself with the fragrant smell of burning tobacco, and peacefully observing the night sky above him. The unnerving scene drags on for several minutes, with the silence of the desert night making the already tense air of the situation all but unbearable. Suddenly, Carson grows even more concerned. With one ear pressed tightly to the ground, he hears a faint, thundering rhythm. He wonders if these are the hoofbeats of more California soldiers coming to join their comrade. Then, Carson feels a hand nudging one of his boots. As Carson strains his eyes down and behind himself, he sees the cause of the noise. It is, in fact, the racing heartbeat of one of his companions, the 24-year-old naval lieutenant Edward Beale. Lieutenant Beale, his nerves pushed to the literal breaking point, whispers to Carson, "We're gone. Let's jump up and fight it out." "Been in worse places before," Carson assures him, then turns back to flatten himself against the desert floor. Finally, the Californio finishes his indulgent smoke and returns to his main camp, much to the relief of Carson and his comrades. Carson is part of a 3-man group of volunteers, comprised of himself, Lieutenant Beale, and a Diegueño native guide named Chamacta. They are on a mission to reach the American-held port of San Diego in order to send reinforcements back to their stranded comrades roughly 30 miles east of San Diego. The day before, the Americans, a combined force of U.S. Army soldiers, Navy sailors, Marines, and civilian volunteers, had fought a vicious battle against the local Californio forces. The battle, known to history as the Battle of San Pasqual, had been fought in the interest of the ongoing Mexican-American War, in which Mexico seeks to retain control of its lands, which comprise most of the present-day American Southwest and Pacific Northwest. When the damp weather had rendered many of their firearms inoperable, the Americans had suffered dearly at the end of the Californio's rudimentary, but deathly effective, steel-tipped lances. After the Americans were able to bring forth and fire their brass field cannons, the Californio forces had been finally forced to disperse, but not before killing 18 Americans and inflicting countless more deep, grievous wounds in the bodies of the surviving men. Under the command of General Stephen F. Kearny, himself gravely injured after suffering a lance wound to his lower back, the Americans had retreated to the top of a small rock-strewn hill. Here, they found themselves surrounded by roaming Californio forces, who covered virtually all of the territory between themselves and their nearest comrades in the port of San Diego, thus cutting off any hope of escape or relief. The U.S. Army soldiers amongst this group of men under General Kearny had not only survived the battle, they have completed the longest cross-country trek in U.S. military history up to that point, traversing half the length of the continent after marching out of Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and traveling through Santa Fe. They had then trekked across the barren deserts of the Southwest before finally meeting the Mexican army in battle here in the desert east of San Diego. Their counterparts in the U.S. Marines and Navy sailors, riding under the command of U.S. Marine Captain Archibald Gillespie, had ridden out to reinforce Kearny's men. Now, these men, many of whom are unable to walk, much less make the 30-mile trek through enemy territory, had to rely on their able-bodied comrades to volunteer to make this perilous journey in order to send back reinforcements and ultimately save their lives. Among these able-bodied men, none was a more obvious choice for this seemingly impossible task than Kit Carson. Among the few participants in the battle on the American side not to hold an official position in the military, Carson has nonetheless already cemented his legacy as an inveterate mountain man, guide, and experienced gunfighter. After deterring a cross-country mission with secret correspondence for President James K. Polk in order to assist Kearny as a civilian guide, Carson had proven an invaluable asset to both the general and his men. Along with Carson, the two other exceedingly brave men, Lieutenant Beale and Chimocta, had volunteered to venture forth into the expanses of the hilly, chaparral-covered desert in order to at least attempt to save their comrades. They had waited until nightfall before making their initial scramble down the sandy cliffs of the rocky hill, being cautious to avoid the California sentries that lined the hillsides all around them. By the time the party had reached the bottom of the hill, it had become clear that their metal canteens would be too noisy to carry with them. They had thus each taken one last, long drink and left their only water supplies tucked into the rocks of a small arroyo. Carson and Lieutenant Beale had also discovered that, unfortunately, their hard-soled boots would cause too much commotion while they traversed the rocky ground before them. While their native comrade Chimocta continued on relatively unencumbered and silent in his leather moccasins, the pair of Americans had been forced to remove their boots, tuck them into their belts, and proceed forward barefoot. Now, as the Mexican soldier rides back towards his camp, Carson and Beale are suddenly horrified to realize that, somewhere in their crawling on the desert floor, their boots have come loose from their belts. Considering their already precarious position, retracing their steps to look for the boots is out of the question, and thus both men will have to complete the 30-mile trek through the thorny desert barefoot. With no other option, the three men carry on, silently trudging their way through the sparse landscape, sticking as best they can to the cover of dry riverbeds and small ravines. Despite their lack of footwear, they travel as quickly as possible, knowing that the rising sun will bring with it a host of new problems. Meanwhile, back at the American camp atop the isolated hill, the men find themselves in increasingly dire straits. Food supplies have already begun to wane, as has their supply of potable water. Many of the injured men are starting to see signs of infection, as the deep and incongruous nature of the damage inflicted by the long steel lance tips makes them exceedingly difficult to close and keep clean. Since the day of the battle, Sergeant John S. Griffin has worked feverishly to tend to the Americans' wounds, but it seems to the doctor that a never-ending stream of the bloodied, injured men pour through the canvas-flap doors of his operating tent. General Kearny himself, suffering from the lance wounds that had torn into his lower back and hip, had passed out on the dirt floor of the tent after insisting that more seriously wounded men be tended to ahead of himself. Simply in order to move the injured men from the site of the battlefield to the hilltop, Kearny's men had constructed makeshift travois. These two long poles, which connect at a point, after which a bed is built between the poles and attached to a horse, had for centuries provided the tribes of the Great Plains with an effective, efficient means of transporting goods and people. However, on the rock-strewn, hilly grounds of the Southern California desert, they provided a nightmarishly jarring, bone-rattling ride for their unfortunate, incapacitated passengers. Now, the few able-bodied men left have taken to killing and cooking their mules, beginning with the weakest and least useful animals, stewing the meat into a thin, greasy soup that the men do their best to keep down, with some being unable to do so. General Stephen Kearny, suffering greatly from loss of blood, has relinquished command to Captain Henry Smith Turner. The general, who had once led his forces out of Kansas to much nationalistic fervor, pomp, and circumstance, now lies prostrate, pale, and helpless inside of his tent. When they had first arrived atop the hill, Turner had ordered some of his able-bodied men to engage and drive off the California Lancer forces that stalked their movements and harassed them incessantly. This his men had managed to do, with their carbines proving far more effective now that the conditions had warmed and their powder had dried. But now, as the Americans languish on the hilltop, Mexican Commander Don Andres Pico's men and other contingents of Mexican soldiers and California volunteers begin to flood into the surrounding areas, looking to cut off any escape for their enemy and to mount a final charge to decimate their forces once and for all. Now effectively trapped and with their ammunition and food supplies dwindling further and further, Captain Turner is faced with the prospect of either turning out their remaining starving mules and horses to graze, in which case they would almost certainly be stolen by the surrounding Mexican forces, or to slaughter the animals immediately, rendering he and his men truly devoid of any means of transportation, save for walking to San Diego. The American soldiers know that, with every Mexican soldier who arrives to surround their position, the likelihood of Carson, Beale, and Chimocta reaching San Diego has become less and less. Don Andres Pico himself has, in fact, surmised that it will likely be Kit Carson, if anyone among the Americans, who will make a bid to escape to San Diego and secure reinforcements. Though the two men do not know each other personally, Pico is familiar with Carson's prior exploits throughout the whole of Alta California. He knows that Kit Carson is a dangerous man, and that in order to secure a victory for the Mexican forces, he will have to be neutralized. Carson is known amongst the Mexican forces as El Lobo, or the Wolf, and Don Andres Pico has explicitly warned his forces to remain vigilant, or se escapada el Lobo. The Wolf will escape. Now, as the hours pass on the hilltop, it seems more and more probable to the stranded men that their comrades' bid to reach American lines in San Diego has failed, resulting in either their capture, killing, or both. But, miles away, past the edge of the western horizon, Kit Carson, Lieutenant Beale, and Chimocta press on through the night, accumulating untold damage to their feet as they plod their way through the unforgiving landscape. By dawn the next morning, they are clear of the initial rings of Mexican security forces that surround their stranded comrades. By that afternoon, they are within 12 miles of the city of San Diego. But now, they face the challenge of navigating undetected through the several rings of security forces that surround the city and its harbor. Seeing that seemingly every known path to the city's limits are blocked by the Mexican sentries, the three men huddle in a shaded arroyo and confer upon their next move. Carson advises that they split up, a chilling proposition to all those involved, but a prudent one, as Carson wagers that capturing 3 individuals will be a tougher job for the Mexican army than simply capturing one group. And so, all 3 determine their separate paths, with Chimocta and Lieutenant Beale taking the 2 shorter routes, and Carson volunteering for the longer, more dangerous route. With no time for ceremony or sentimentalities, the 3 men part ways, heading west to the California coast, with each knowing that they will either succeed in their endeavor or, likely, die, and that the lives of their comrades stranded on the hilltop depend on them. All through the afternoon, into the night, the 3 men skulk through enemy territory, each on an individual journey of turmoil, peril, and endurance that will test them to their absolute limits. It will be past midnight when Chimocta and Beale reach the American lines, arriving around the same time, with each man so fatigued that they have to be taken to the USS Congress, stationed in the San Diego harbor, where they will linger near death for several days. Carson staggers into camp around 3 a.m., his more circuitous route having delayed him even longer than his comrades. In a near-delirious state of exhaustion, Carson confirms the location of Kearny and Gillespie's forces on the hilltop with Commodore John F. Stockton. Stockton informs him that reinforcements have been dispatched, and Carson finally partakes in the first food, water, and sleep he has seen in nearly 36 hours. Meanwhile, the men stranded on the hilltop still with no clue as to the whereabouts of their relief party, continue with their struggle to care for their wounded comrades, with their infected wounds presenting increasingly more frightening spectacles with seemingly every examination, as well as to sustain themselves amid their shortage of food and water. The last of the starving mules are finally killed, their ailing and withered bodies offered up as a last-ditch form of sustenance to their starving masters. Though it is an unfortunate necessity, one that provides much-needed nourishment to the men, the gruesome, heart-wrenching spectacle of this slaughter only serves to further weaken morale, as well as to cement the notion that they are truly without escape in the middle of the barren Southern California desert. In order to quench their thirst, the men dig into the sand, until reaching a layer that has retained some level of moisture from the recent rainfall. The soil is heaped into squares of cloth, then any available liquid, however muddy and disagreeable, is wrung out. For 2 long days and nights, this harrowing ordeal continues. Finally, though, General Kearney is able to regain enough strength to return to command. His field sergeant, Dr. Griffin, informs him that, likewise, most of the injured men have regained enough strength to sit horseback. With their supplies nearly gone, and any hope of rescue seeming to be fleeting, Kearney orders the men to ready themselves for a forced march to San Diego at first light. Come what may, they will not sit on this hilltop to fall prey to their adversaries. At dawn, they will make a run for their lives to the coast. However, that night, as the tired and battle-sore men sleep fitfully, an American sentry on guard is sent into a near panic by the sound of an approaching force of cavalry. He calls out into the darkness, "Halt! Who goes there?" The call goes unanswered, with the thundering hoofbeats only getting closer and closer to the sentry's position. With his weapon now shouldered, the sentry calls out again, "Who goes there?" This time, however, the reply nearly brings the weary man to tears of joy as Captain William H. Emery, commander of the 200-man relief forces dispatched from San Diego, calls out, "Hold fire! We're Americans." The American camp now resounds with the cheers of men who, only hours before, had seen their hopes of survival as all but lost. In the midst of their celebrations, a single shot rings out from a Mexican sniper hidden in the hills, striking harmlessly into the ground. It would be the last shot of the entire engagement, as the Americans would find all of the Mexican forces gone in the morning, having returned under nightfall to Los Angeles to fortify that city against the newly realized American threat. The combined American forces will make their march to San Diego without so much as seeing another opposing soldier. They arrive on December 12th on a chilly, rainy day, much to the relief of Carson, Stockton, and the rest of their countrymen. Many among the American soldiers are overcome with emotion upon seeing the Pacific Ocean for the first time, as the endless stretch of water before them represents the culmination of their unprecedentedly long and arduous transcontinental journey. Though the war is not over, it feels for many of the young sailors, soldiers, and Marines that the worst of the war, for them, has come and gone. The spot where they had made their desperate stand and survived on the flesh of their mules will stand as a landmark of San Diego history, known forevermore as Mule Hill. What has only begun, though, is the national renown and celebrity of Christopher Houston Carson. His leadership during, before, and after the battle, and his willingness to lay down his life in order to aid in the rescue effort, make him a favorite topic of letters written home from American soldiers, sailors, and Marines now stationed in San Diego. One soldier pens a particularly effusive letter home to his parents in Connecticut, proclaiming that, "Never has there been a man like Kit Carson. All that has been said about him, and more, is true. He is as fearless as the lion, as stealthy as the panther, as strong as the oxen. I believe that Carson would attack a fort filled with Mexicans, single-handed, and drive them off." Carson, for his part, barely even acknowledges his accomplishments in his memoirs, writing laconically that, "Finally got through, but had the misfortune of having lost our shoes. Had to travel over a country covered with prickly pear and rocks, barefoot. got to San Diego the next night. In the years to come, Carson will become a national media star, the subject of dime novels and newspaper articles that will cause his name to be as well known in many eastern cities as the President. The young naval lieutenant Edward Beale is said to have convalesced for an entire year before returning to active duty with the Navy, but he too will go on to national acclaim and a legendary career spanning decades of service in the Old West. Already known as a hero of the Battle of San Pasqual, he would rise to even greater fame in 1848 as the man to bring the first samples of gold from the streams of Northern California to the cities of the East. This tangible proof of the newly won state's gilded bounty would be a key driving factor in the 1849 California Gold Rush, an event that would reshape the nation forever. He would go on to a career as a successful diplomat, serving as superintendent of the Office of Indian Affairs before retiring to life as a rancher. He would remain friends with Carson, who remarked upon seeing his friend aboard the USS Congress that he, quote, did not think that he could live, as well as maintain friendships with Buffalo Bill Cody, William Tecumseh Sherman, and Ulysses S. Grant, among others. He would pass away in 1893 at his home in Chester, Pennsylvania. Chomocta, the Diegueño native guide, by some accounts took a similarly long time to recover, and, by some accounts, perished as a result of his treacherous journey. His tribe, known amongst themselves as the Kumeyae, already brought to the breaking point under the yoke of decades of California rule, would continue to struggle under the United States government for much of the 19th century. They would play pivotal roles in the San Diego Tax Rebellion of 1851, also known as Garra's Revolt, as well as the Yuma War and even the Mexican Revolution. Today, Chomocta's band, the San Pasqual Band of Diego Mission Indians of California, is a federally recognized tribe, with many of their tribal members residing on the San Pasqual Reservation. As for Kit Carson, he will take over a week of recovering in San Diego before regaining the ability to walk normally, his feet so battered by the desert floor that he can scarcely take but a few steps without excruciating pain for days. But recover he will. Carson will soon be on the trail again, heading west to reunite with his family in Taos, New Mexico. Already an American icon and an inveterate frontiersman, Carson will go on to continue his exploits for decades to come. His travels will take him from San Diego, back through the treacherous deserts of Arizona and New Mexico, then to St. Louis, before finally settling in Taos for a few years before continuing his adventures. Though the Mexican-American War in California will continue with a series of minor skirmishes, the worst of the action in California has largely passed. The Battle of San Pasqual will go down as the bloodiest, most consequential battle of the Mexican-American War to be fought on California's soil. The Mexican-American War itself will drag on until 1848, finally coming to an end with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But, though the men of Kearny's army can now take their rest, the battles that are taking place further south into Mexico, and the battles that will continue to unfold for the coming year, will go down as some of the most vicious, bloodthirsty combat ever waged in the 19th century. But the stories of the many brutal battles of the unforgiving and highly controversial Mexican-American War, as well as the many tales from the life of Kit Carson, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the join button below. And we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.